All right, the next couple of lectures, which will be a little bit more extensive because we're going to be talking about how the body controls blood pressure. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about what happens short term. And short term means like instantaneously, within seconds, you make adjustments that help maintain your blood pressure within a normal homeostatic range. Next lecture, we'll talk about longer term blood pressure controls. And longer term means more like anywhere from responses that take minutes to days to really get underway and help you control your blood pressure on a longer term basis. So short term, constantly blood pressure fluctuates all the time throughout the day. And in order to maintain blood pressure homeostasis, we have to have these instantaneous changes that take place. These are obviously very critical for our survival. Longer term, and if you have some sort of longer term issue with maintaining your blood pressure, there are adjustments made largely through the kidneys that impact blood pressure for a longer period of time. Okay, short term blood pressure changes, the ones that occur within seconds, are controlled both by the nervous system, your sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, and also hormones. So we'll talk a little bit about the hormonal control as well. What's altered for short-term blood pressure changes? Peripheral resistance, so constriction of blood vessels will increase your blood pressure, dilation will lower it, and cardiac output. Anything that increases your cardiac output will increase your blood pressure. Anything that decreases it will lower it. Longer term, renal, that term refers to the kidneys. The kidneys are the chief regulator of your blood pressure on more of a long-term basis, and that's done through blood volume. So remember, you have three factors that affect blood pressure: cardiac output and peripheral resistance, and then the third one is blood volume. So the adjustments to blood volume are more important for longer-term, minutes to days adjustments on your blood pressure. And that involves hormones such as aldosterone and ADH, and perhaps you remember we talked a little bit about atrial natriuretic peptide at the end of the endocrine system. That's a hormone that's secreted by the heart that actually helps you reduce your blood volume when you need to reduce your blood volume. All right, so the rest of this lecture, we're going to focus in on these shorter term mechanisms that are involved. And at first, we're going to focus in here on how the nervous system is involved with helping you control your blood pressure on an instantaneous type level. Okay, so how does our nervous system control peripheral resistance? Now, you've already learned back in Unit 2 how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems control cardiac output. So keep that in mind. You've already had that information, but it does apply here as well, because anything that increases cardiac output increases your blood pressure. Things that decrease your cardiac output decrease blood pressure. All right, peripheral resistance, as we've already talked about, constricted blood vessels increase peripheral resistance. That increases blood pressure. Dilated ones will help lower your blood pressure. And I do want you guys to be careful about cause and effect, because sometimes students who are new to these topics have trouble distinguishing between the cause and the effect. Okay, so your body has ways of detecting low blood pressure. That's what we're getting ready to talk about. And if your blood pressure is too low, the response that your body is going to make is to increase peripheral resistance. Okay, so you're going to go from a dilated blood vessel that you see over here in cross section to one that's constricted. That's going to increase your blood pressure. So the final response or the final effect here is to increase our blood pressure. Okay, so the cause here was we increased our peripheral resistance. The effect was blood pressure went up. Sometimes students get that reversed, and they think that increased blood pressure increases peripheral resistance, and that's not the case. So don't flip-flop those two types of things. Or sometimes students will think, all right, so increased cardiac output increases your blood pressure. Increased blood pressure does not increase your cardiac output. It doesn't work in reverse. So you got to learn the stories and keep things in proper sequence and order. Okay, so the nervous system controls short-term for blood pressure control involve reflex arcs. Reflexes are, if you think back to when you studied the nervous system in Biology 201, these are nervous system activities where you have incoming information, decisions are made, and then signals are sent outward to cause changes to take place, and the brain doesn't have to get involved. They're reflexes. You know, kind of like when you stick your finger on a hot stove and the high temperature causes you to jerk your finger away. That involves a reflex that occurs just through your spinal cord. Your brain doesn't even have to think about that. If your brain had to get involved into making that decision, you would severely damage your fingertip before you moved your finger away. Same thing with blood pressure control. Maintaining proper blood pressure is so critical that you don't have time for your brain to get involved in every possible decision about controlling your blood pressure. So much of this occurs through our reflex arcs. Well, I'm saying your brain's not getting involved. Your brain does, because the brain stem is a part of the process, but not up here, not your cerebral cortex, not the thinking part of your brain up here is not involved in those processes. Okay, so these reflex arcs include some sensors called baroreceptors, and baro here is referring to pressure. So you have sensory neurons that are able to detect pressure changes. And then the cardiovascular center in your medulla oblongata in the brain stem, so it's not the thinking part of the brain, receives these signals from the baroreceptors and makes the decisions and sends outgoing impulses to trigger changes. And then you have vasomotor fibers. Those are nerve fibers that extend out to your heart muscle and will help influence cardiac output. And you have fibers that extend to your blood vessel or vascular smooth muscle tissues to help control constriction. Also, sometimes you have input from chemoreceptors. So chemo refers to chemicals. So chemoreceptors are sensory nerves that respond to changes in things like oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, or pH. You know, pH is a measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ion levels in your body fluids. So they respond to those as well. All right, so let's take a little bit closer look at this cardiovascular center in the brainstem and the medulla oblongata. Now, we've already talked about the cardiac centers that are located in the medulla oblongata, because we talked about how this area in the brainstem influences cardiac output, because you have a cardiac acceleratory center in the brainstem in the medulla, and you have a cardio-inhibitory center in the brainstem as well, and both of those help control your cardiac output. So if you guys remember, this diagram here on the top reviews for you. Let's see, are my drawings showing up here? Let me see. Yeah, there we go. This diagram here on the top reviews for you how this area in the medulla oblongata controls heart function. So in purple there, the purple line, that represents parasympathetic nerve fibers that extend from the medulla through the vagus nerve, and they extend out and influence the SA node and the AV node. So they help regulate heart rate. Remember, parasympathetic nervous signals decrease your heart rate. They decrease the depolarizations of your SA and your AV nodes. Decreased heart rate decreases your cardiac output, which will decrease your blood pressure. And then in green over here, this is a depiction of sympathetic nerve fibers. So sympathetic nerve signals travel to the SA and the AV nodes of the heart, and also the walls of the heart itself, because they'll actually stimulate more forceful contractions of the cardiac muscle fibers. So the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate, increases contractility, contraction force of the myocardium. Both of those things will increase your heart rate. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system activity increases cardiac output, parasympathetic activity lowers cardiac output. Within this area in the brainstem, you also have an area called the vasomotor center. And the vasomotor center is going to receive signals about blood pressure. And if blood pressure is too low, the vasomotor center is going to send impulses through sympathetic nerves. These sympathetic nerves extend, at a microscopic level, into the smooth muscle located in blood vessels. If you have increased sympathetic nervous system activity, it will increase peripheral resistance, because those nerves are going to stimulate the smooth muscle cells in those blood vessels to contract. So your blood vessel diameters will go down. That will increase peripheral resistance, and it will increase blood pressure. If you have reduced signaling through those sympathetic nerves, those blood vessels are going to relax. They're going to dilate, and your blood pressure will go down. Now, typically, you do always have some signaling through those sympathetic nerves that extend from the medulla up in here in that vasomotor center through these sympathetic nerve fibers and out to your blood vessels. You always have some signals that helps maintain what is called vasomotor tone. So you always have some constriction of the blood vessels to help maintain normal blood pressure. Okay, so these cardiovascular centers receive inputs from the baroreceptors. These are pressure receptors we're getting ready to talk about, and to some degree chemoreceptors. And there are higher brain areas as well that have influence over these types of things. So the thinking part of your brain, your cortex up here, and the hypothalamus also gets involved. Remember, our good old hypothalamus gets involved in helping to maintain or influence blood pressure as well. All right, so what are these baroreceptors we keep talking about? Pressure receptors. These are special sensory neurons, sensory nerve tissues, whose job it is to respond to changes in blood pressure. And where are they located? They're located in areas called the carotid sinuses. So over on the anatomy side, you're learning about the internal and the external carotid arteries that bring oxygenated blood up toward the brain. Where those two fork from the common carotid artery, common carotid artery divides into the internal and the external carotid arteries. At that location, you have an area called the carotid sinuses. And so within that area, you have neurons that sense pressure changes. Also in the aortic arch, right in here where the aorta is making that arch so that it's going to curve behind the heart, you have baroreceptors as well. And also in some of the large arteries of the neck and the thorax, the chest, you have some of these baroreceptors also. All right, so when those baroreceptors sense increased stretching of the walls of these arteries, the aorta, the carotid arteries, those larger arteries in the chest, they send signals up to the cardiovascular center in the medulla. Okay, and then once they do that, the vasomotor center realizes, oh, well, the blood pressure must be up because the baroreceptors are sending me more signals. Okay, and so then what are we going to do? We need to we're going to need to decrease blood pressure. So how are we going to decrease blood pressure? There are two ways that we can do that. One is to decrease your cardiac output. If we want to decrease blood pressure, then we need to decrease our cardiac output. And we can decrease our peripheral resistance if blood pressure is too high. Okay, so in order to lower cardiac output, you want to inhibit that cardio-acceleratory center we talked about before that sends sympathetic nerve signals to the heart and increases heart rate, increases contractility. You want that inhibited. You want to increase cardio-inhibitory center activity. That's the parasympathetic branch. That's going to lower your heart rate, which will lower your cardiac output. Okay, so that's one thing that's going to happen. The other thing that's going to happen is you are going to send fewer signals to blood vessel walls. So you're going to have lower signals to blood vessel walls. And so that will reduce vasoconstriction. Okay, so your blood vessel walls will dilate, and that will help you lower your blood pressure. All right, so you're going to inhibit the vasomotor center. That's what's controlling blood vessel constriction and dilation. All right, so we can take a look at this on this diagram from your textbook, which is showing you how this homeostasis is maintained. Again, this is involving short-term instantaneous type control of your blood pressure. So again, your stimulus, increasing blood pressure. So this is supposed to be a depiction of the carotid sinus area. This is where the common carotid artery here is splitting off into the internal and the external carotid artery. So within the walls of those arteries, you have sensory neurons. Those are the baroreceptors. As those walls get stretched due to higher blood pressure, they generate action potentials that travel up their axons to the brainstem area where you have your cardiovascular control centers. The cardio-inhibitory center will send more parasympathetic signals to the heart. The cardio-acceleratory center will be inhibited. Okay, so we have decreased sympathetic activity, increased parasympathetic activity. Both of those things are going to help us lower cardiac output. You'll have decreased signaling through the vasomotor center, decreased sympathetic signaling to the walls of your blood vessels, which will allow them to dilate. And then that helps lower peripheral resistance, or your textbook sometimes is just using R for resistance rather than peripheral resistance. Okay, so both of those things will help lower cardiac output and lower peripheral resistance, and that'll bring your blood pressure back into a normal range. All right, now what about when your blood pressure is too low? All right, so if your blood pressure is too low, let's just flip over here and take a look at the diagram from your textbook. That's our stimulus. Blood pressure has dropped. If blood pressure has dropped, then those baroreceptors in the walls of those arteries are not sending as many signals, or maybe they're not sending any impulses up to the cardiovascular control centers in the medulla because the walls of those arteries are not being stretched. Okay, so the response then is from those cardiovascular control centers, you increase sympathetic impulses to the heart. Okay, and remember the sympathetic branch of your nervous system increases heart rate, increases contractility. Both of those increase your cardiac output. That will lead to increased blood pressure. Also, the vasomotor center is going to send increased sympathetic impulses to the walls of blood vessels. So you will increase your peripheral resistance as those blood vessels constrict, and that also will help you increase your blood pressure. All right, so you experience this frequently. Let's say you're lying down on the couch, you're resting, and when you're lying down in a reclined position, your blood pressure drops because your body, your cardiovascular system is not fighting gravity as much. So your heart rate slows down, your blood pressure can go down because you're not having to circulate. It's not as difficult for you to maintain the blood flow because you're not fighting gravity. Now, when you stand up, you know how if you stand up suddenly, sometimes you can feel really dizzy for a minute, and that's because your body has not yet made those instantaneous blood pressure adjustments to make sure you're getting blood flow up to the brain as quickly as it needs to get up there. And your brain is very sensitive to that. Within seconds, reduced delivery of oxygen to the brain can start to make you feel woozy. And what happens in those situations, you may have noticed that for temporarily, your heart will feel like it's beating faster. And that's because that response has been made. This response that we were just talking about has occurred. Your heart starts beating faster to increase your blood pressure and make sure you get proper blood flow up to the brain and to other tissues in the body. Okay, so those baroreceptors in those larger arteries are the chief things that are used to sense blood pressure changes in the short term and to trigger responses that are made. However, there are also chemoreceptors. These are separate little areas of sensory nervous tissue that respond to chemical changes that occur in the blood. And we're going to talk more about these when we get to the respiratory system, because the chemoreceptors, they're really more involved in respiratory changes. But these are able to sense things like an increase in CO2 in the blood, or if you have a drop in pH, or a drop in oxygenation of the blood. All right, so let's think about this for a minute. If you have a drop in O2, for example, decreased O2, your tissues need more oxygen gas. So if you have lower levels of oxygen gas in your blood, you're going to need to circulate that blood faster to the tissue so that they can get the oxygen that they need. So decreased O2 levels will trigger an increase in blood pressure. Likewise, an increase in CO2. Where does CO2 come from? CO2 is a waste product of cellular respiration. So your CO2 levels go up if your tissues are metabolizing really quickly. They're doing lots of cellular respiration, breaking down lots of nutrients, generating that carbon dioxide waste. So that is a signal to your body that, hey, we better increase blood pressure so that we can get rid of this excess CO2. We need to pump that out to the through the pulmonary circuit so that we can remove that CO2 through the lungs. And also, increased CO2 says, hey, the tissues in the body are metabolizing really, really quickly, doing lots of cellular respiration, so we better jack up blood pressure and circulate oxygen gas and nutrients to your tissues as quickly as possible. Drop in pH is also a sign that CO2 is building up in your body fluids. Increased CO2 drops the pH. CO2 functions as an acid in your body fluids, which we will talk more about at the end of the semester. We're not going to really get into that so much now. Also, when you were studying the muscular system, you may remember that lactic acid is a waste product produced by skeletal muscles, especially during periods of intense activity, and that can also lower the pH of the blood and the body fluids as well. So drops in pH are a signal to your body, hey, let's jack up blood pressure to help clear out the waste and make sure our active tissues are getting all of the nutrients and oxygen gas that they need. Okay, so chemoreceptors, when they detect the things that are listed here, you will have increased sympathetic impulses from those cardiovascular centers. So you're going to increase heart activity to increase cardiac output, and the vasomotor center gets activated, sends sympathetic impulses to your blood vessels to help increase your peripheral resistance. All right, higher brain centers. So these cardiovascular centers are located in the medulla oblongata, and you know, the things that we've been talking about occur through reflexes. So the higher areas of the brain don't have to get involved, but the higher areas of the brain can certainly influence your blood pressure. That includes the hypothalamus and also your cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain. And those parts of the brain are connected to these cardiovascular control centers in the medulla. The hypothalamus, you know, back when we were covering the endocrine system, we talked about the hypothalamus and its involvement in stress responses, particularly with controlling cortisol levels that are secreted from the adrenal cortex. So the hypothalamus is involved in helping to maintain blood pressure, so it's going to be connected to these cardiovascular control centers as well. The hypothalamus also helps control how blood flow is distributed to tissues. It's involved in things like deciding, okay, we're exercising, so we better increase blood flow to skeletal muscles to help support exercise. And it's also involved in helping to control body temperature. You know, you're exercising, your body begins to overheat, so your hypothalamus has to trigger responses that help maintain your body temperature at safe levels. Things like sweating and dilation of blood vessels. Remember learning about that before? Those types of things are controlled by the hypothalamus. All right. Hormones, there are hormones that are also involved in shorter term control of blood pressure. And these include epi and norepi, those hormones that are secreted from the adrenal medulla. Both of those hormones help increase cardiac output, which we studied back in chapter 18. They also can stimulate vasoconstriction. So those hormones can directly, as they're diffusing through the blood and they come into contact with the smooth muscle inside blood vessel walls, they will trigger those smooth muscle cells to constrict, and that helps increase blood pressure. Then there's a hormone called angiotensin II, which we will talk about more in the next lecture. This is a hormone whose production is triggered by the kidneys, and it stimulates vasoconstriction, which helps raise blood pressure. And yes, it's involved in short-term effects, but also has longer-term effects. So we'll talk more about it in the next lecture. ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. We certainly talked quite a bit about that when we did the endocrine system. It's an anti-diuretic, which means a diuretic makes you excrete more water in your urine. Anti-diuretic has the opposite effect. You retain more water in your bloodstream and other body fluids. That's going to increase your blood volume, which is going to increase your blood pressure. So ADH is really more involved in longer-term blood pressure control, not this instantaneous type blood pressure control. But let's say you're in a crisis, like you're hemorrhaging due to an injury. You have very high levels of anti-diuretic hormone that get secreted from the posterior pituitary gland during crisis periods like that. And so ADH in that instance will not only trigger your kidneys to hold on to more water out of the urine, but ADH in those instances also tells your smooth muscle cells in the walls of your blood vessels to constrict and help maintain your blood pressure. All right, then finally, atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. We talked a little bit about that at the end of the endocrine system. Atrial tells you where this hormone is made. It's made in the atria of the heart. Natri here refers to sodium. Sodium, the abbreviation for it is Na. So natri here, which is a Latin term, is referring to sodium. Uretic means to excrete through the urine. All right, so this hormone, which is a peptide, it's a chain of amino acids, triggers more sodium secretion in your urine. Okay, that's what that means. So water follows sodium. Water loves sodium. And so if you are excreting more sodium ions in your urine, water's going to follow. That's going to increase your urine volume. You're going to pee more fluids out from your from the body. That's going to lower your blood volume. And so what is that going to do to your blood pressure? It's going to lower it. Another thing that ANP, that's going to be more of a longer term type thing as well, but in the shorter term, ANP can also stimulate vasodilation, dilation of blood vessels, and it does that by antagonizing some of these other hormones we've learned about, like aldosterone. ANP is the antagonist to aldosterone, one of those hormones that we studied quite a bit back in Unit 1, and which we'll talk about more on the next video lecture as we get into longer term control of blood pressure. All right, and just as a reminder, epinephrine and norepinephrine, those are secreted from the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla is essentially like a modified portion of the sympathetic nervous system. So as your sympathetic nervous system activity increases, you have sympathetic nerves that extend into the adrenal medulla and trigger the cells there to release larger amounts of epinephrine and norepinephrine that get into the blood, circulate all throughout the body. Epi and norepi have lots of effects on the body, but three very important ones are to increase heart rate, increase contractility of the heart. Both of those increase cardiac output, and then they also trigger vasoconstriction, which also increases your blood pressure. All right, so lecture number 8, the next one, we will discuss some longer term control of blood pressure. And again, longer term means beyond instantaneous. So it can be minutes to days. And this is largely going to occur through actions of the kidneys, through hormones, and these hormones wind up influencing blood volume to impact blood pressure.